Hello, I'm Helena Castaneda.
And I'm Anna Zamberlin Eidelman.
And we're the FPF Sociology 3AC, December 5th, 2025, Professor Theon-Huong, Villarreal. So we will be presenting on the effects of boarding schools on mental health of Native American communities. To begin with our introduction, Native Americans have the highest suicide rate out of any other racial or ethnic group in the United States. Why? With so much of their history being hidden, covered up, or not even talked about, many of us are unaware of the forces that got them to this devastating point today. This presentation searches to find out why this is. Our research topic, significance and purpose. With troubling statistics showing extreme mental health disparities between Native Americans and other groups, we use the sociological imagination to focus on the Native American boarding schools as a macro-level analysis of historical oppression. This research examines boarding schools as a form of institutionalized racism rooted in the U.S. social structures, drawing on conflict theory to explain how power and domination shape their design and impact. By identifying the most harmful elements, family separation, cultural erasure, and forced assimilation, we address long-term outcomes linked to structural and political exclusion and the loss of cultural capital. Understanding this history helps us inform strategies to improve Native mental health and prevent similar harm in the future. In what ways did Native American boarding schools of the late 19th to the mid-20th century cause a long-term impact on Native American mental health? Our thesis. Native American populations have staggering statistics of mental health problems, suicide rates, and substance abuse issues, which we understand through the sociological imagination and the macro-level analysis of long-standing historical oppression. These disparities stem from centuries of violence, of coerced policies embedded in the U.S. social structures. However, we focus specifically on Native American boarding schools, in what ways did the Native American boarding schools of the late 19th to the mid-20th centuries cause long-term impacts of the mental health of Native communities? We find that the eradication of Native culture, widespread abuse, and the forced separation of families in these schools reflect institutional racism and structural and political exclusion, producing trauma that remains visible in present-day mental health outcomes. The destruction of language, traditions, and kinship networks are also disrupted by cultural capital, deepening the effects across generations. Many survivors I interviewed examined what I called boarding school syndrome, PTSD including recurring intrusive memories, nightmares, flashbacks, and detachment disorders, deficient knowledge of traditional culture or cultural skills, trouble sleeping, poor anger management, deficient parenting skills, tendency to abuse alcohol or drugs.
On to the loss of culture and identity that boarding schools inflicted on Native Americans. So boarding schools strip Native communities of their culture, causing a loss of identity and community disruption, which was a form of forced resocialization. This erasure of language, religion, and philosophy represents deliberate cultural suppression and contributes to long-term historical loss shaped by social control. Some examples of the loss of culture were Native Americans' names were changed to American or Christian names from their original ones. They were forbidden from speaking their tribal languages, and they were forbidden from any spiritual practices. From the National Library of Medicine, they said we found that 1/5 to 1/3 of Indigenous adults reported thoughts pertaining to historical loss daily or several times a day, and that these thoughts have negative emotional consequences. This shows the relevance of the loss of culture and identity from the schools. This created internalized discrimination against themselves. The National Library of Medicine also showed that historical loss correlates with perceived discrimination, which is recognized as one of the most damaging psychological stressors that cause mental health problems. And a loss of language and sense of place/identity. One native said, "I felt sanded. I had lost out on so much deep meaning within our tribal spirituality by not being able to speak Ojibwe." This created feelings of isolation and a shattered sense of belonging. Moving on to the abuse, which caused intergenerational trauma from boarding schools. Abuse was rampant in boarding schools, which created cycles of intergenerational trauma that still persist today, reflecting structural violence and the breakdown of protective community systems. These schools were hubs of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, often inflicted when children spoke their language or practiced aspects of their culture. Forms of coercion was rooted in power. For speaking their only language, children had their mouths washed out with soap, were forced to kneel for hours on a hard cement floor or on a broomstick, were stripped and immersed in ice-cold water, had their hair pulled, legs, heads were slapped, etc. The abuse was often orchestrated by headmasters, matrons, nuns, or even priests, reflecting the coercion rooted in power. And these are other forms of abuse that children endured. Sexual abuse was also hauntingly present. One child at the St. Francis Indian Mission School recalls witnessing young girls being taken in the night by priests and nuns alike and returning to their beds crying and refusing to speak to anyone about what had occurred. And there are lots of similar instances to this across different boarding schools. The abuse that victims endured in schools caused trauma that spanned across generations. Abuse of this nature has shown to lead to unhealthy coping mechanisms, poor emotional regulation, and overall poor mental health of individuals that had left the schools. When parents who struggle with trauma have and raise kids, they often project and teach these unhealthy behaviors to their children, and this results in the mental health disparities in Native populations that we see today. From the National Library of Medicine, descendants of boarding school attendees raised by someone who had attended report higher rates of anxiety, PTSD symptoms, and suicidal ideation. Also, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, nearly 1/5 of American Indian or Alaskan Native adults experienced mental health illness in the last year, and suicide is the second leading cause of death for Native youth ages only 10 to 14.
So now we'll be talking about the separation of families due to boarding schools. U.S. government boarding schools, beginning with Carlisle in the 1879, forcibly removed Native American children from their families to achieve assimilation policies that aimed to kill the Indian and save the man. What this meant was children were taken hundreds of miles away, often without parental consent. They were forbidden to speak their languages or practice cultural traditions. An estimated 25% to 35% of Native American children were removed from their families prior to the Indian Child Welfare Act of the 1978. Family bonds and tribal kinship systems were intentionally broken. The long-term impact of this caused returning children to struggle to reconnect with their families and their heritage, and disrupted parenting practices which caused futures of inadequate parents, resulting in childhood trauma and mental health concerns of future generations. So our counter-arguments for this is most people often ignore or attempt to deny that the disparities between the mental health of Native Americans and any other groups are due to historical oppression. They instead either use racism as a base to claim that the disparities are just inherent, that boarding schools were not incredibly harmful institutions, that they were or ignorant to the fact that the boarding schools and the historical oppressions of Native Americans existed altogether. We hope that this presentation can give factual clarity to anyone holding these beliefs. Our conclusion. We have found that the eradication of Native culture, widespread abuse, and the forced separation of families in these schools have produced a sense of isolation and internalized discrimination, intergenerational trauma, and weak family relationships, all which contribute to the present-day mental health outcomes we observe. Native Americans have suffered long enough, and we hope this PowerPoint serves to educate and inspire viewers to take action on finding routes to help. These are our works cited, and thank you very much.
Thank you.